This is Jeff Miller from A Dash of Insight, and we're talking with Bob Deely about the history of recessions over the last 50 years or so. And we're up to the most recent recession and the experience we had with Mr. Model in forecasting this recession. Welcome back, Bob.
Jeff, glad to be here. Have to admire your patience for wanting to sit through all of these. We'll hope our listeners are have hung in with us because we're now up to the very last recession, which gave us a very interesting set of data and also several other important lessons about the forecasting of business cycle peaks and troughs. The 2007 recession gave us a very different type of profile from Mr. Model than we had in all of the other prior events. As you can see by looking at the chart and the way that we've talked about the signals that were put out, in this recession, we made it through the 200 basis point line, which put us on alert. But then we never had the sharp downward spike down into negative territory that we had in every other event except the 1960 cycle that we talked about earlier. There were two reasons for this. The first was the Federal Reserve's amount of tightening this time did not have the same degree of inversion in the yield curve as we had previously. And part of this had to do with the way that this recession unfolded. We tend to forget that this was really two episodes. We had one that started in December of 2007 and which was met with a response by the Bush administration and the Federal Reserve in which they realized that the economy was rolling over and steps needed to be taken to try and mitigate that mitigate those effects, But then we got to the breakdown of the financial system in the fall of 2008, and that led to their easing monetary policy to a degree that we had not seen. So what this did to the aggregate spread was that instead of having it continue on the downward course that we associated with the early parts of a downturn, it began to move up in response to the easing by the Fed and the subsequent steepening of the yield curve. In addition, from the other side of the model, we had considerable gyrations in the inflation rate that were entirely associated with energy prices. And as a consequence, instead of having the pattern that we have seen in other recessions, we ended up with this sideways bouncing around the 200 line, which until the line then broke sharply higher at the end of the recession, was completely different from the configuration we saw previously. Now we can talk about this in more detail with some close-up views that we have of the 2007-2009 episode. But the thing to keep in mind here is that the signals that we got for the model did put us on alert to be wary of the onset of a peak and a trough. But the way that those signals developed and how they were managed both by the Fed and by both the Bush and the Obama administrations gave us slightly different interpretations that required a reminder, put it more succinctly, a reminder that this is part art and part science. The signals from the model were correct, but interpreting them to profitable advantage was a little bit more difficult this time.
So, in looking at this, I mean, would it be fair to call this a false positive, or what were you telling your clients when you got? And we want to remind everybody that this chart has been advanced 9 months as well. So, what was the message you gave to your clients when we had this first crossover?
Well, I think we should talk about that in a little bit more detail in another segment that we talk about that and only that.
All right. So thank you for this segment, and maybe in our next chart we'll focus on the last recession period and what we can say about the current environment.
Sounds good.